Does the brain control behavior? Yes. The brain and nervous system controls our behavior. How does it do that? First of all, if we're talking about movement, behavior generally means movement. We have two categories of neurons that are very important to think about in the context of neuroplasticity. We have what are called lower motor neurons. These are neurons that are in the spinal cord, but they extend a wire that we call an axon out into the peripheral nervous system, into the body, and those neurons connect with muscle. They send electrical potentials out there that allow our muscles to twitch and to contract. They are generally involved in doing what they are told, and they are told what to do from two sources. We have circuits in our brainstem, so this would be kind of around your neck, deep in the brain, that are called central pattern generators. These are sometimes called CPGs. Central pattern generators are what allow us to generate repetitive patterns of movement. So inhaling and exhaling subconsciously is controlled by a central pattern generator. That just means a collection of neurons. These neurons in the brainstem send information down the phrenic nerve and control the diaphragm, so it goes inhale, exhale, and you don't have to think about that. You could think about it, and you could change the durations of inhales and exhales and change that up, but the motor neurons that control that are just responding to what the brain is telling it to do. But then there are the upper motor neurons. The upper motor neurons actually reside in our motor cortex, way up on top of the brain, and they are involved in sending signals for deliberate action. Okay, so they send signals to the lower motor neurons, which are the effectors, the ones that actually control the muscles, but the upper motor neurons are the ones that send very specific signals. For instance, the signals that would allow you to make a cup of coffee in the morning or to deliberately engage in any kind of behavior. Now, you can probably make a cup of coffee in the morning without having to think about it too much. It's almost reflexive for you now, which means that a lot of the information about how to perform that particular movement has been passed off to circuitry that's now more or less in the brainstem and below the motor cortex. Now, why am I giving you all this detail? Well, if you want to change motor patterns, you have to know where in the circuitry changes are possible, and you ought to know where the changes are most likely to occur. You also need to know how do you signal to the brain and nervous system that a change is necessary. The way to create plasticity is to create mismatches or errors in how we perform things. The way to create plasticity is to send signals to the brain that something is wrong, something is different, and something isn't being achieved. And I think this will completely reframe the way that most people think about plasticity. Most of us think about plasticity as, okay, we're going to get into this optimal learning state or flow, and then suddenly we're going to be able to do all the things that we wish that we could do. Well, I hate to break it to you, but flow is an expression of what we already know how to do. It is not a state for learning. Flow is an expression of nervous system capabilities that are already embedded in us. Errors and making errors out of sync with what we would like to do is how our nervous system is cued through very distinct biological mechanisms that something isn't going right, and therefore certain neurochemicals are deployed that signal the neural circuits that they have to change. Making errors over and over and over again is the route to shaping your nervous system so that it performs better and better and better. It's a falsehood that everything that we do and experience changes our brain. The brain changes when certain neurochemicals, namely acetylcholine, epinephrine, and dopamine, are released in ways and in the specific times that allow for neural circuits to be marked for change, and then the change occurs later during sleep. The signal that generates the plasticity is the making of errors. It's the reaches and failures that signal to the nervous system that this is not working. People understandably get frustrated, like they're trying to learn a piece on the piano and they don't know how, they can't do it, or they're trying to write a piece of code, or they're trying to access some sort of motor behavior and they can't do it. And the frustration drives them crazy and like, I can't do it. When they don't realize that the errors themselves are signaling to the brain and nervous system, something's not working. And of course, the brain doesn't understand the words, something isn't working. The brain doesn't even understand frustration as an emotional state. The brain understands the neurochemicals that are released, namely epinephrine and acetylcholine, but also, and we'll get into this, the molecule dopamine when we start to approximate the correct behavior just a little bit. So what happens is when we make errors, the nervous system starts releasing neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that say we better change something in the circuitry. And so errors are the basis for neuroplasticity and for learning. And humans do not like this feeling of frustration and making errors. The few that do exceedingly well in whatever pursuits they happen to be involved in. The ones that generally don't do well. They generally don't learn much. And if you think about it, why would your nervous system ever change? Why would it ever change? Unless there was something to be afraid of, something that made us feel awful will signal that the nervous system needs to change, or there's an error in our performance. So it turns out that the feedback of these errors, the reaching to the wrong location, starts to release a number of things. This would be epinephrine. It increases alertness, acetylcholine, focus. And this is why frustration that leads us to just kind of quit and walk away from the endeavor is the absolute worst thing. Because if acetylcholine is released, it creates an opportunity to focus on the error margin, the distance between what it is that you're doing and what it is that you would like to do. And then the nervous system starts to make changes almost immediately in order to try and get the behavior right. And when you start getting it even a little bit right, that third molecule comes online or is released, which is dopamine, which allows for the plastic changes to occur very fast. Now, this is what all happens very naturally in young brains, but in old brains, it tends to be pretty slow, except for in two conditions. If you are uncomfortable making errors and you get frustrated easily, if you leverage that frustration toward drilling deeper into the endeavor, you are setting yourself up for a terrific set of plasticity mechanisms to engage. But if you take that frustration and you walk away from the endeavor, you are essentially setting up plasticity to rewire you according to what happens afterwards, which is generally feeling pretty miserable. So now you can kind of start to appreciate why it is that continuing to drill into a process to the point of frustration, but then staying with that process for a little bit longer is the most important thing for adult learning, as well as childhood learning, but adult learning in particular. I mean, is when you're really in a mode of repeating errors, not deliberately. You're trying your best to accomplish something and you're failing. You're absolutely failing. You want to keep making errors for this period of time that I'm saying will last anywhere for about 7 to 30 minutes. It is exceedingly frustrating, but that frustration, it liberates the chemical cues that signal that plasticity needs to happen, and they also signal the particular neurons that are active. It's signaling different components within the networks between the brain and body, and it's trying to figure out, wait, where are these errors coming from? Where are the errors coming from? It's those neurons. They're making the mistakes. They're making the mistakes. They're making the mistakes. And it essentially highlights that pathway for change. The other ways in which we can learn more quickly, besides just making errors, is when something really surprises us. And if we're positively surprised by something, or we are just flooded with this molecule dopamine, then there's a great opportunity for plasticity. But dopamine is when we think we're on the right path toward an external goal, a little bit is released and it tends to give us more motivation toward that goal. I think everyone could stand to enhance the rate of learning by doing the following. Learn to attach dopamine in a subjective way to this process of making errors, because that's really combining two modes of plasticity in ways that together can accelerate the plasticity. So earlier I talked about making errors and having a focused bout of learning that includes making a lot of errors inside of that learning bout. That is going to be frustrating, but the frustration itself is the cue. And epinephrine will be very high under those conditions. But if you can just subjectively associate that experience with something good and that you want to continue down that path, well, then you now start to create a synergy between the dopamine that's released when we subjectively think something is good, tell ourselves something is good, and that situation of making failures. In other words, making failures, failing repetitively, as well as telling ourselves that those failures are good for learning and good for us, creates an outsized effect on the rate of plasticity. It accelerates plasticity. And I get asked a lot, well, how do I get dopamine to be released? Can I just tell myself that something is good when it's bad? Well, actually, yes. Believe it or not. The thing about dopamine is it's highly subjective. What's funny to one person is not necessarily funny to the next. So it has to have some sense of authenticity for you. But if you really want to be learning the thing that you're trying to learn, that should be reason enough to tell yourself, well, I'm frustrated, but the frustration is the source of accelerated learning. So make lots of errors. Tell yourself that those errors are important and good for your overall learning goals. So learn to attach dopamine, meaning release dopamine in your brain when you start to make errors. Then I start getting lots of questions that really are the right questions, which are, how often should I do this? And when should I be doing this? And find the time or times of day when you naturally have the highest mental acuity. And that's really when you want to engage in these learning bouts. And then get to the point where you're making errors, and then keep making errors for 7 to 30 minutes. Just keep making those errors and drill through it. And you're almost seeking frustration. And if you can find some pleasure in the frustration, yes, that is a state that exists. You've created the optimal neurochemical milieu for learning that thing.